we have made breakthroughs in reverse engineering of, extraterrestrial craft. That's actually what I sincerely believe. I think that we have the craft. I think that we've had it for a very long time. I think that we finally figured out how some of it works. I think that there's probably extraordinarily dangerous implications of understanding how that technology works. It's not just, the government blocking, free energy or anti-gravity machines that would change humanity. There's probably very serious implications to, weaponizing those technologies. But I think that this information is going to continue to spill out, and it's going to create a very, very interesting, world for us here very quickly. So I think we're going to have breakthroughs in space travel that are going to go way beyond anything that SpaceX is doing. SpaceX is going to look like, a horse-drawn carriage versus the tech that we actually are probably already, capable of deploying.
Imagine spending an hour with the world's greatest traders. Imagine learning from their experiences, their successes, and their failures. Imagine no more. Welcome to Top Traders Unplugged, the place where you can learn from the best hedge fund managers in the world so you can take your manager due diligence or investment career to the next level. Before we begin today's conversation, remember to keep two things in mind. All the discussion we will have about investment performance is about the past, and past performance does not guarantee or even infer anything about future performance. Also understand that there's a significant risk of financial loss with all investment strategies, and you need to request and understand the specific risks from the investment manager about their product before you make investment decisions. Here's your host, veteran hedge fund manager, Niels Kaastrup-Larsen.
A new world order is becoming clearer by the day, and in our Global Macro series, I want to dig deep into the minds of some of the most prominent experts in many different fields to help us better understand what this new global macro-driven world may look like. We want to explore their perspectives on a host of important issues and hopefully dig out nuances in their work through meaningful conversations. Our guest today has been following a very different topic that we normally don't discuss on this podcast, but nevertheless, it has become very topical. And so despite being a bit out of this world, so to speak, I think we need to pay attention. And therefore, please enjoy my conversation with David Dorr. David, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today for what I'm sure will be an out-of-this-world conversation as part of our Global Macro series. Now, I first came across your work very recently, actually. I was listening to a podcast with you and Grant Williams, and immediately I thought to myself, I have to get David on my podcast to talk about this because it's so fascinating and I'm really curious. And that's, as I told you just before we press record, that is the beauty of these podcasts, is that if you're curious about something, you can kind of just have a conversation with people who know lots more than you do. So welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Niels. Pleasure to be here with you.
Good. Now, since this is your first time on our podcast, at least, perhaps I could ask you to maybe set the stage a little bit, provide a bit of background, context for the conversation, telling us maybe a few highlights from your own background, and what you spend time doing, as this is of course going to be relevant for the conversation. Then we'll dive into all of the topics afterwards.
Absolutely. So by background, I'm a career trader. I started trading. I grew up in the Midwest in the United States. Started trading commodities as a teenager with my youngest brother. And very soon into that, not knowing, of course, anything that we were doing, as most nascent traders start off that way, we slowly kind of gravitated to finding our own strategy, the things that clicked with us. And that strategy specifically is discretionary global macro. And so I've got nearly 25 years, doing discretionary global macro as an investment and trading strategy. And because of that, what we found is kind of our unique space, our niche within the investment world, is that with discretionary macro, a large part of that is connecting dots around the world, right? It's a top-down strategy. And for us, what we look for to find our edge is the things that maybe people are not paying attention to. And over the years, we've gotten really good at that. The conversation we're going to have today is going to be a very interesting sample of that. I think we're the only macro guys out there talking about the subject of, galactic macro, as we affectionately like to call it. But yes, that's been our whole career, and we try to exploit alpha by finding things that are trending, something that's important to you, and the topics that you cover. We look for themes that are trending but are not yet reflected in asset classes, and then we look for those asset classes to start moving at the same time. And when those are merging together, you have a nice kind of wave that you can ride that others maybe were not paying attention to and didn't jump on.
Okay, no, that's cool. That's great. That's a really good background. Now, as you, as I alluded to, maybe, and you sort of hinted at, I mean, today's topic is completely out of my comfort zone, I have to say. I don't really know much about it. It's something that I would say, on and off paid attention to. I've even watched a couple of Netflix documentaries a few years ago, mostly when, honestly, my wife wasn't paying attention because I think she would thought I was a bit crazy spending time on this topic. But the other thing that's really great about the topic is that I think it's safe to say that most people have an opinion about it. So they either think it's real or it's not. So, what I'm curious to know is that, has there been any experiences in your life where you may have brought up the topic and where people have kind of thought, well, David, what's going on here? Why are you suddenly talking about this type of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those listening, the topic here is UFOs, and that's starting to become a bit more mainstream. It's a topic that kind of ebbs and flows, but is becoming a bit more mainstream, especially in the last couple of weeks, with the United States for the first time shooting down 4 things over U.S. airspace, one of which was a Chinese spy balloon, the other 3 of which we don't know what they are. And the Pentagon still has not provided information on those objects that have been shot down. And I'm not saying that those are, alien spacecraft, but they do meet the definition of unidentified flying objects. And to give a little context for our background, and to answer your question, yes, people tease me all the time on this until I start to present the evidence. And the stigma around the topic of UFOs and extraterrestrials is significant. Little green men hopping out of, spacecraft and, everybody wearing tinfoil hats. What's interesting about the history of this is that that's not a coincidence. You have actual documentation showing that, our intelligence departments, our military, they intended to create that stigma because when you look at the evidence, there were some very difficult things to answer. And so I want to share a little bit about my background. I'll share a story with you that actually, I haven't shared on any of the other podcasts yet, that really it really opened up for me the possibilities of interesting things going on. So by background, this was a subject that, was dinner table conversation in my family. My father was really into this. My dad is a very open-minded, but also a very serious guy. He's somebody that likes to see the evidence. He's not just listening to, UFO story and, takes it as it is. And when we were kids growing up in Missouri, and grew up in Columbia, Missouri, and 2 hours away from us is St. Louis, Missouri. And for those listening that may know St. Louis, or for those of you that don't, St. Louis has an exceptional science museum. It's absolutely fantastic. They're known for, a couple of things, the Cardinals, the zoo, and the Science Center. So when we were kids, we went to the Science Museum, and in their planetarium, they were doing a series, this piece about the Betty and Barney Hill case. This was an abduction case from the 60s. And it was a couple that was abducted, allegedly. And later they were both hypnotized. And what's fascinating about this is that they were hypnotized because they were experiencing trauma and nightmares. They had this missing time. It was unexplainable. They weren't sure what had happened to them. They didn't allege that they were abducted from a UFO. This came out underneath the hypnosis. And this is where the story is going to get really interesting. So it's one of the best recorded cases that exists. And underneath hypnosis, they both told a very similar story of being taken aboard a craft. Now, the wife, Betty, told this story that she was sitting in kind of an examination room, and she was able to recall seeing effectively a star chart on the wall. So much so that she drew it. So those listening, you can look it up. You can see what she drew. Now, here's where the Science Museum comes into this. They're telling this story, and they're showing the chart of what Betty drew, okay? And she was showing what, appeared to be a star map. And originally, several, scientists looked at this and said, well, we don't see anything that lines up with these stars. Perhaps this is her imagination. And then one investigator had a very brilliant idea. They said, you know what? We're looking at this from the point of looking out at the stars from being here on Earth. But if she's actually on a craft, she might have a different perspective. Let's start rotating star maps and see if we can line it up. And so they simulated this at the Science Museum. It was amazing. I'll never forget this experience as a kid. So they did this simulation, rotating it around, and guess what, Niels? It lined up perfectly. Now, how is that possible, right? How somebody in the 60s, it has nothing to do with, stars or astrophysics or anything like that, drawing a star chart under hypnosis, that when you 3D rotate it, it looks like something from space looking back, towards Earth. So this is kind of what started my fascination, as a kid, on this subject matter.
Okay, cool. Now, often we have, I guess, we get interested in stuff when we're kids, and at some point we kind of move on and do something, focus on something different. Is this something that actually stayed with you, or did it also kind of, at a certain age, you can, okay, fine, that was fun, went to the museum, all of that, and not really paid attention to it, and then it reappeared for some reason? Or I just want to sort of understand your journey a bit more.
Yeah, it's a great question. No, just as a hobby, it's always been with me. I've always found it a fascination. I've kept tabs of, various cases and everything else. But again, that really remained a hobby for me, and a general interest on the side that didn't really, crisscross with my professional job as an investment manager and trader until 2017. And 2017 was a very significant milestone because this was an inflection point for disclosure directly from the United States Department of Defense. And that was the crossover point.
Okay, cool. And you know what also makes it really interesting, in my view, is that no one really in the investment world is paying attention to this. So I understand your fascination with it. I'm very interested as well. But I'm also intrigued by the fact that nobody else are paying attention to it, at least, in the broader investment sphere. All right. Great background. Let's dive into some of these topics. And again, since I don't have any experience with this, I kind of thought, let's divide it into two groups of questions to begin with. One would be kind of significant events that we or that about, heard about, and whatever I've heard about, I can ask you whether you know anything about it. And then also the other interesting thing is maybe some of the key people who are coming forward, who've been involved in this for a while, people we think maybe be credible, et cetera, et cetera. So let's dive into these questions now. I realize that some of these events were not known at the time. And by the way, I actually also think that there are some events from many, many years ago, decades ago, and I'm not even up to speed. So if you want to bring something up from the 60s and 70s, feel free. What I found in my short time to do a bit of research here was kind of certainly an important event that took place in 2004, as far as I can tell, but I don't think we were informed about until 2018. And that is what's called, what's been named this tic-tac encounter. So, as I said, feel free to go even further back. Otherwise, feel free to start with 2004 and the tic-tacs.
Yeah, well, one incident that I'll add, and there's several, right? I won't go too far into Roswell, which is the most famous case for the United States, which, by the way, for those listening, it's worth diving into, and not a coincidence. We'll circle back to some conversation on this. It's not a coincidence that the United States National Defense Authorization Act of 2023 allows Congress to go back and collect information all the way back to, predating Roswell. There's zero coincidence about that. There's very serious reasons for that. And we believe that, Roswell was actually something that took place, not just a conspiracy theory, but something actually took place. But I think one of the incidents that people, may not be familiar with, but is well documented, is in 1952. So people say, well, aliens and UFOs, this is nonsense. If they wanted to reveal themselves, why wouldn't they just, land on the yard of the White House? Well, in 1952, they practically did. They didn't land on the yard, but there were sightings right over the White House in 1952. We scrambled jets to chase them and were unsuccessful in doing that. But it is a widely reported, it was in the papers, it was covered. I mean, this is an incident that is actually well known, but is often forgotten about. So our incidents with, UFOs is nothing new. Now, going to the 2004 case, the reason that one is so incredibly significant is because the multiple sensors, witnesses, our fighter pilots, Commander Favor, as well as other pilots. There was a pilot that was scrambled after he returned that went and recorded the Tic Tac. So for those listening that are not familiar with this has been on the news a lot since 2017, which is kind of when it came out. But we had in 2004, the USS Nimitz was with the carrier fleet. They were practicing off the coast, about 100 kilometers off the coast of San Diego. And what was happening is, and it wasn't just on a single day, over a series of days, their radar operators were seeing stuff on radar that was dropping from 80,000 feet to 50 feet above the ocean. And I mean, this is fascinating. I mean, they had 14 of these things zipping from 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet to 50 feet. They believed that because of the radars that they had, they believed that they were actually entering our atmosphere, because at about 80,000 feet, you're seeing the curvature of the Earth. You're practically right there heading into space. And these radars kind of max out at 80,000 feet. So they were entering the radar at 80,000 feet coming down. They also believed that these objects were coming up from the ocean and traveling back up through 80,000 feet into space. And this is where you're hearing is some of the definitions, trans-medium craft. And this is the idea, we have objects that are intelligently controlled that can cross from water to air to space effortlessly without creating any sonic booms. And these things were pulling 12,000 Gs in maneuvers. There's absolutely nothing that, that we make that does that stuff. This is very, very, very serious technology. And Commander Fravor, he actually had an encounter. He went to, he was scrambled with his jets to go, look at this Tic Tac that was hovering above the ocean. And, they get out there and he dives down to get a closer look at it. And all of a sudden this object engages with him. He's actually on the recordings saying, I'm engaged. Oh shit, I'm engaged. This is a very serious thing for a fighter pilot to say, especially a trained career fighter pilot. And what happened is as he dove, this Tic Tac kind of zipped around him and started rotating at about 180 degrees around him. And this is part of the, the Tic Tac story, and which, by the way, I encourage everybody to look this stuff up. It's better hearing from, Fravor himself than me. But again, to reiterate why it was so important is because you had eyewitness testimony, you had radars, you have multiple types of radar, you have multiple witnesses from fighter pilots to people that were on the battle carriers. This is probably the most documented case from a data perspective, and that's why it's so significant. And it's relatively recent. And 2004 is not. It's not like Roswell, in the 40s.
Okay, no, I mean, super fascinating. We'll come back to some parts of this, I think, as we move forward. Now, from what I could dig up, there is another case. So, is it correct that we are told about this in 2018? Did I get that right?
Yeah, approximately. I mean, I think it was actually technically 2017 that the videos were released, because 2017 was when the Department of Defense acknowledged videos of the Tic Tac. So I believe it was actually the end of 2017.
Okay, cool. Now, I've also managed to dig up that in 2019, July, there were, again on the West Coast, and according to this source, there were 10 unidentified ships, or whatever we call them, and they were going around multiple U.S. Navy ships, including the Omaha, and over a few days, I think there were 100 sightings or 100 ships. Obviously, could have been the same ships. I don't know. So, do you know anything about that incident? That seems also pretty significant.
Yeah. Very significant. So what's interesting is that, early on, part of that story, there was kind of an attempt to explain that away because there was a ship, I believe.
The cargo ship.
Yeah, there was a cargo ship, I think, with a Hong Kong flag or something that was nearby. And it was first a bit explained away as perhaps these were Chinese drones, as an example, that were launched from that ship. But that does not fit at all with the actual data. So there's a couple things about drones, right? When drones leave, they ultimately have to kind of come back to where they launched from. And, what was happening is these things were flying and they flew west. And first of all, again, you have these things that can just hover without any sound, without any visible propulsion mechanism. And they kept heading out, heading west instead of coming back. So it didn't fit any of the characteristics. But what's really interesting about that case that hasn't really made much media attention is the eyewitness testimonies from crew member that were actually, above deck witnessing these things. And what they report was that, and this sounds like it's straight out of a science fiction movie, but they were reporting beams, like the sky would light up as bright as day, green, kind of a green lit sky that was just, clear as day, except, green. And we don't know any drones that do that. And we don't know why they would do that. And how would they have the capability to light things like that? When there's encounters with these objects, and this goes back since the very beginning, the encounters surrounding the sources and form of light are always unique. It's not just light. It's light that we don't really know how to reproduce. It does interesting things. We don't understand it. And so you have eyewitness testimonies as recently as 2019 with that. You also have fighter pilots, Brian Graves, who's amazing. He's got a podcast now called Merged, which is fantastic. He's a fighter pilot on the East Coast and with the gimbal video. So for those of you that have seen the gimbal video, or if you haven't, check that out. That was another one that was, acknowledged by the Department of Defense. They filmed a UFO effectively rotating at 120 knots, in U.S. airspace. And what our fighter pilots on the East Coast are saying, and multiple fighter pilots are saying this, is that they're encountering UFOs on a daily basis. This isn't like, hey, once a year. It's on a daily basis. They've had stuff, they've been flying in formation. They've had UFOs fly right between the wings of two fighter jets. And, and there's been reports on this because of the concern for flight safety for our military personnel. And of course, as Marco Rubio and other senators have been saying, is that, hey, we have stuff over U.S. airspace and we clearly don't seem to be able to control it or know what it is.
So are those incidents the ones that I tried to, again, in my brief period of research, are those the ones that happens around February 2019, around something called the Oceana Base or W72? Or is that actually even different?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with.
No, I just found something where they were talking about F-18 pilots taking pictures on their iPhones, etc., etc. But it all surrounded this Oceana Base W72 area, which is on the east coast of the US. But anyways, sounds like that might. So you're not familiar with any of that Oceana Base specifically that I picked up here?
I'm not familiar with the Oceana Base, but it's probably around the same incidents because there were a whole bunch around that same period.
Yeah. We're going to talk about some of the people. You've mentioned a couple of names. We're going to do that later. But I do think there's a couple of other kind of, not just events, but also terminologies that I would love for you to talk a little bit about. And one of them is something, I guess, that's been around for a long time in the narrative, at least, and that's Area 51. Can you talk about, what we know and what we don't know about that?
Yeah, Area 51 is certainly made its way into, global pop culture because, again, people associate it with UFOs. But very few people know the reason that it's associated with UFOs. So Area 51 was, effectively a U.S. secret base. That's fact. That's not, conspiracy. It's a U.S. secret base, and that's where we tested, and many would claim that we still do, some of our absolutely, top secret, best aircraft. The SR-71, which, came out in 1969, was originally being tested and flown out of there. One of the fastest, pieces of aircraft that's ever been built, an amazing piece of technology. And so Area 51 was known for, kind of our top secret development. And what happened was, what really put Area 51 on the map was Bob Lazar. So Bob Lazar was a physicist that purportedly worked at Area 51 and was working on propulsion systems of craft from, off-world craft that had been recovered. And he was tasked with sorting out how did the propulsion systems for these UFOs work. And he claimed that in the hangar that he worked at, he had seen 9 different craft that the U.S. military had in its possession. And he came out, he was very scared for his life. George Knapp, a reporter and investigator in Las Vegas, actually broke that story. And, and Bob Lazar, a young physicist, tells the story of what he was working on. Before that, nobody knew what Area 51 was, Groom Lake, SS4, which was out the S4, which was one of the areas that he worked in. And he went out there. He took video recordings later from the mountain ridges, and you would see weird stuff, just, lights just shooting up straight into the air, flying around, coming back. And as we know, Area 51 was later expanded. So, you used to be able to get a lot closer and kind of see some of the stuff from the mountain ridges. And then they expanded that so that, to keep the public out. So that's kind of generated this mystery and intrigue around Area 51. But it is a real place, and, there's real things going on out there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and you already brought up one of the people I wanted to ask about, so that's a good thing. But before we get to more of the people, there are 2 other quote-unquote events that I just wanted to ask you a little bit about. That is one that takes place in Mosul, so that's Iraq, in April 2016. What happened in Mosul?
Yeah, so this is recent. Jeremy Corbell's the expert on that. So Jeremy Corbell had this image that was released to him. And my understanding is that this image is a still shot from a video. And I believe the video is a couple minutes long, but effectively a metallic looking sphere over a conflict zone in Mosul was taken by one of our, spy craft.
Because it's a Pentagon video, right? It's not just any video, it's a Pentagon video. Yeah, okay.
Correct. And this is the key. There's been a handful of people that have done a great job of getting information released that is coming from the Pentagon, the DoD, from different, branches of our U.S. military. Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp is one group. And then you have Tom DeLonge and Chris Mellon, and Lou Elizondo, which is, another group. But all of them have done just an amazing job with, getting information released and, and having witnesses come forward.
Okay, cool. Final question before we go into some of these people in a little bit more depth, and that is New York Times breaks a story, I think in December 2019. Tell me, first of all, if that's the right time, but also what's significant about this as you can tell?
Yeah, I believe it was December 2017 was the first New York Times article. And that's when it hit our radar. No pun intended. So I remember I was actually home in Miami for Christmas, and this New York Times article comes out, and it made some of the mainstream news rounds, but then also died off very quickly because we were heading into the Christmas holidays. But what was fascinating about the New York Times article was a few key points. Number one, it was revealed that there was a government program called ATIP that was actually funded and studying UFOs. And this was something that had been, funded by Harry Reid. So Senator Harry Reid, who's, since passed away. And it's important to mention, a lot of people don't know or maybe have not heard of what the Gang of Eight in Congress are. The Gang of Eight are, you have 8 congressmen or women that are able to be read on to secret programs. So there's only 8. They're not allowed to share that information with anybody else. When they meet, they have to meet in a SCIF and which is a secure facility to have, top secret information passed to them. So Harry Reid was part of the Gang of Eight. at that time. And he had provided funding for this program to study and what was going on. And that's where this information was coming from. So effectively, the New York Times broke that article. And that's where we all kind of got introduced for the first time to Lou Elizondo, who was in charge of the ATIP program, and subsequently quit because he didn't feel that there was enough disclosure and didn't feel that there was enough taking the matter serious as, a potential threat to, U.S. airspace and to the United States.
Okay, fascinating. I didn't know about that. Okay, so I want to go back and just for people to get the context, because I think sometimes it can be difficult to fully understand. So you mentioned Bob Lazar, and you mentioned him revealing stuff to George Knapp, but this is a long time ago, as I understand, right? This is not recent. This is like 30 years ago or something like that. Is that correct? Or
yeah, every bit. I think it was the 80s. Yeah,
late 89 or 90, thereabouts. Yeah.
So Bob Lazar has been a controversial character in the UFO history, and it's interesting. I encourage everybody to study up on it if they find the subject interesting. Watch the movie about him that Jeremy Corbell did, and form your own opinion. I remember when his story first broke. My dad was watching it, and so first I would start with let's go back to the origin story. He was a physicist, and he came forward and said, "I'm working on some pretty wild stuff. I'm working on UFO propulsion." And George Knapp, for those that may not be familiar with George Knapp is a very serious guy. Now he's followed and tracked, the UFO phenomenon and paranormal activity around it, pretty much his whole career. But his career as an investigative, journalist and, presenter on television is very serious. I mean, he's tracked stuff, normal things, corruption in Las Vegas, mob-related activity, murder cases. He's a very serious guy. And when Bob Lazar's story first came forward, I can't remember the person that introduced him to Bob Lazar, but it wasn't like Bob Lazar just picked up the phone and called the media. There was somebody in between them that had said, "Hey, listen, I think this is important. I think that it's serious," and encouraged George Knapp to sit down with him. And so George Knapp got into his story and found it compelling. And again, remember, nobody knew Area 51 even existed. So when you start doing kind of the investigative piece and you're checking it out, it starts checking these boxes. You have this guy telling this, fantastic story. And obviously that requires some investigation. And piece by piece, George Knapp was able to verify the things that he was saying. And Jeremy Corbell, who's kind of George Knapp's protege, continued that recently. So in the last 5 years, they did a documentary on Bob Lazar. Now, the reason Bob Lazar is a bit controversial is because later in his life, he got himself in trouble, and I think he got arrested, as part of some sort of prostitution ring, something really silly out in Las Vegas. And so people have taken that and said, "Oh, this guy, he's not credible," or anything else. Well, listen, yeah, he's an idiot if he got himself busted in a prostitution ring, but that doesn't take away from, his narrative about being a physicist, working on, Area 51, being able to substantiate that. Jeremy Corbell was able to find a security guard officer that was in charge of people coming in and out of the base and verified that Bob Lazar was actually there when he said he was. So I think that he has a lot of credibility on that topic. Maybe the rest of his life is a bit of a disaster, but that's, you got to kind of segregate those two things and hear out what he has to say. But fascinating story that he shares.
Absolutely. And I think actually also to be completely balanced about it, I think the other thing that they found was that he had lied about his educational history, and they also tried to discredit him for that. But I think your point about that other people, and now maybe with more openness, have actually kind of confirmed the stuff he said about these things, makes it interesting. Okay, so you again, just going maybe, I wouldn't say chronological order, because that's hard for me when I don't know much about the topic, but Harry Reid, you're right. Interesting. Obviously, most people will know him, former majority leader of the U.S. Senate, blah, blah, blah. But he actually also has a connection to George Knapp. Again, confirming your in a sense, your description about his seriousness, because I think they go back like also about 30 years. But of course, the seriousness, as I can tell, about George Knapp is that he's very good at keeping stuff confidential. If he's told it's confidential, he's not going to reveal it until it's allowed. And so many of these relationships have been there for a while, but has never been talked about, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, that's correct. George Knapp's he's a pro. He protects and respects his sources, and because he's covered some pretty serious stuff, he's built a good reputation for those things. So there's definitely a bit of a nexus point with Nevada because Area 51 is there. You know, a lot of our nuclear testing was, you know, out in the desert, Nevada, Utah, and, you know, New Mexico. So a lot of the UFO encounters and stories, you know, not coincidentally, are related to that area of the United States. Certainly not only that area, but a lot of things around there. So one of the connection points between George Knapp and Harry Reid is a gentleman named Robert Bigelow. So Robert Bigelow had an aerospace company, and he was convinced as well that there were, you know, strange things going on. And he's a bit of a recluse, but he did a 60-minute video many years ago, and he was asked point blank, you know, what do you think is going on? And he believes that, you know, we have aliens that are here that are visiting us with advanced technology. And again, I know that this sounds we have to go back to the stigma. You know, somebody on your show here saying, yeah, we've got aliens and everything else. It sounds silly. But when we take a step back, take that macro view for a moment. Is it really preposterous that would be happening? You know, as many people have suggested, that's always been happening, right? Anybody that's watched the Ancient Aliens series on, you know, the History Channel, which is a bit dramatized, you know, we have, you know, things that suggest this has been going on for a very long time. And to us, you know, to me, that's actually, you know, logical that it would be. Long story short, returning to Bigelow, is that it was Bigelow's aerospace company that was actually funded by Harry Reid. So there's $22 million in funds, and this is part of what came out in the 2017 New York Times article. So he actually had formed a team that was involved in investigating these things. Much of that information, by the way, still has not yet been disclosed. So it'd be very interesting to see some of the additional things that came from that, because what is telling is that Harry Reid had worked very hard to have that program that was funded designated a secret access program. And one of the reasons that he wanted to have that done as a secret access program is so that he could give them more access to investigate other secret access programs, including trying to get access to what Lockheed Martin is sitting on.
Right. Yeah, we'll come to that for sure. Now, it's interesting you say this thing that people might think that here we are, two people talking about things that are completely crazy. And I did think about, before we press record, that this is either going to be the most popular episode we ever released or the least or the
worst.
least popular. No, the worst. Right. So we won't know. I'm hoping for the former. Now, okay, so we've talked about Harry Reid, Bob Lazar, George Knapp, and we talked about Area 51. And there's not connecting all of these, but connecting Area 51 with George Knapp is definitely this guy that I picked up on called, he's called Alfred, or he's named Alfred O'Donnell, called Al O'Donnell. And he worked at a company called EE&G, which I think came out of MIT in the 70s. I'm not sure, but thereabouts. Can you tell me something about Al O'Donnell and why he may be important as well in this story?
Yeah, it's funny. You'd mentioned that name. I was not familiar with him. You know, my team. Yeah. I'll have to look. You've given me some homework to check out. You know, we know some of the other people that were involved with that. Eric Davis. Of course, Hal Puthoff, as well as some other investigators that were with that. But that wasn't a name that I recognized off the top of my head.
Okay. So let me tell you what I found out. This is interesting. So what I found out was that this EE&G company was actually the company that was paid to run Area 51. And he was the general manager of it. And therefore he had access and was there. And my understanding was there was very few people with that kind of access. And apparently, according to George Knapp, they become, well, his son, so he has two sons who are both, one is in public service, so elected official, and the other one also had a job where you would say, yeah, that seems pretty credible. Anyway, so the son connects his father with George Knapp, and they meet over a period of time, a number of times, and and he does share, according to George Knapp, that yes, in Area 51 there are, I don't know what we call them. I don't want to call them aliens because we don't know what they are. But there are things that fly inside of these objects, and we have them. Or I say we. I mean the U.S. government have them. So then what my understanding is that after a few of these conversations, so to speak, and these are happening probably a while back, he suddenly says, I can't talk to you anymore, la, 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 la. And George Knapp also says that a number of people, because he was very public about asking for information, basically, quote unquote, get silenced, threatened, that don't speak with this guy anymore, and so on and so forth. But Al O'Donnell apparently had promised to record what he knew on video before he passed away, because he was an elderly gentleman. So whether that tape exists or not, I don't know. George Knapp thinks that maybe one of his sons has it, but I have no idea. So anyways, that's the story, and that's why he's interesting, because of Area 51 and few people with access. He was one of them, it seems. Anyways, the other thing you mentioned was this thing about, that it might be a little bit crazy hearing people talk about UFOs. And I did come across actually a former Canadian defense minister, Paul Hollier, I think, or something like that, who, and this is many years, this is like a decade ago, came out saying that that the US knows that there essentially are UFOs, and they've even developed some kind of energy from using some of that technology. And I can't remember, he also went on to say that they had also found ways to communicate with them or not. But what I also picked up, and again from very little time to prepare for this, was that he had said something in a speech in 2008, where he had said something like that they want to stop us from destroying ourselves. And I know we're going to jump to that a little bit later, but when I read that, and this is like 15 years ago, I'm thinking, could the reason why we're suddenly hearing so much more about it now in 2023 be because looks like we're on our way to destroying ourselves again, with all the unfortunate conflicts that we have seen? Anyways, that's just pure speculation on my side, but I couldn't help. I
agree.
Yeah. Okay. You've talked about David Fravor, the pilot who filmed or encountered with the Tic Tac, so he's an important one. I don't know much about this Tom DeLonge, but I have heard the names Chris Mellon, Hal Puthoff, and Lou Elizondo, or something like
Elizondo.
Elizondo. Can you just briefly, why are they important? And maybe what we start doing, because there's one other person we need to talk about, that's Jay Stratton. And I want to ask you about something called the Wilson Davis memos, which I don't know about, but I've heard you mention it. So can you do chronologically order? Maybe we end with Jay Stratton, because he's important in the now. I mean, now we bring it all the way to now, but maybe you can give us a bit of background on the other people.
Yeah, so, and I'll preface this, in what I say to everybody when it gets into this subject is that everybody should expect that there's going to be a very high, noise to signal ratio that just goes part and parcel with the subject matter at hand. And so what I always encourage people is that, people say, well, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? There's lots. This was the part where it became very interesting to us, getting to investigating this on the professional side. There's lots. We have metals that are being studied by universities right now that we can't explain how they're, machined or made. You have, of course, the information's coming out from the Department of Defense. So I always encourage people, take your time. work through it. You don't need to take anything, as is, as it's presented, but take your time, look into it. It's fascinating. So from the perspective of Tom DeLonge, I mean, I tell this story, and to me, it sounded silly. This is this goes back to 2017. This is the crossover point for us taking it serious, professionally, and saying, what kind of impact is this going to have, on markets, on the world, on humanity? And what happened in 2017 is part of the New York Times article is that when these interviews started coming out in the news, there was reference to the STARS Academy of Arts and Science, which is founded by Tom DeLonge, the lead singer for the rock band Blink-182. And I remember at the time just, talking with my family about this and my team and going, what the hell? What in the world does Tom DeLonge have to do with getting full chain of custody of, UFO videos from the Department of Defense? Like, I can't square that, what's going on here. So here's the backstory for your audience. So it turns out that Tom DeLonge, as he was touring, as a rock star, his hobby also, much like mine, just on the hobby side, was UFOs. He enjoyed the subject matter, read a ton of books on it. And he actually wrote a fictional book on it, kind of putting together what he thought was, what happened historically. And that book is called Secret Machines. It's actually a pretty entertaining read. And after he wrote the book, people from the DoD actually reached out to him. And as he tells the story, he was taking a few clandestine meetings, and he made this proposal to, folks coming from the intelligence community saying, listen, I acknowledge that you guys got a tough job. This is pretty serious stuff. And I can imagine that there's really good reason that, a lot of this stuff, wouldn't or shouldn't be disclosed to the public. But I believe that the public is mature enough that some of it can and should be. And that's how he tells the story of, how this got going. And that's how he ended up meeting Chris Mellon. Chris Mellon was the secretary underneath the Department of Defense. So very, very serious guy. Everybody should look up Chris Mellon. When you see him, this is a very lucid career, intelligence, person. Lou Elizondo, same thing, career in U.S. intelligence, counterintelligence. He ran the ATIP program. And so this kind of these group of people start coming out. And I remember when we looked up to the STARS, Academy of Arts and Science, and we saw the names of the people that Tom DeLonge had working for him, like Hal Puthoff, I was just mind blown. I was like, okay, this is super serious stuff. This guy, for whatever reason, don't judge him for being a rock star and not being able to do other things in his life. He connected and he stimulated a conversation. And it's in large part, and thanks to him doing that we have a lot of the disclosure that's rolling out, as well as, and I think this is more important. So when people ask me, like, why now? Like, if you followed this your whole life, like, why do you care now? Why is this interesting to you from an investment perspective? It's the momentum. We have legislative momentum. We have disclosure momentum. We have an exponential increase in data and witness testimony from all our military branches. That is what's compelling to me. And again, Tom DeLonge, thanks to him, a lot of that is now kind of bubbling up to the surface where we can all kind of see that and start to ponder what's going on. Is it nuclear related or something else?
Okay, I mean, that's cool. And because I think it's a good segue to then go to Jay Stratton. You talk about the momentum, you're talking about, across agencies and departments, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about Jay Stratton a bit? Because I think he's obviously current day now, like some of the other ones, of course, but has more recently changed his career so that he can be more open about what talking about these things.
Jay Stratton's probably one of the reasons that he's so interesting is because he's spent a career in the intelligence field, and he has consistently for many, many, many years worked across these various programs. So, we had ATIP. Before that, it was UA swap, or it had a very unusual name. There's all these acronyms that have been used as these programs.
Yeah, the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Application Program.
There you go. See, yeah, now you're up to speed as well. So he's been involved with all these programs, which is unique. right? And he's taking a stance. In fact, he's with Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp. Just yesterday, they were presenting out in California and doing a Q&A session on this topic. So I think the biggest thing that Jay Stratton brings to the table is that he's kind of the one guy that, as an intelligence officer, has been across so many of these programs. He's the one person, at least so far, that's been identified that has been involved with multiple iterations of these programs. And he's taking a more recent stance, as you alluded to kind of open these things up, to say, hey, this is a conversation. This is information that we need to bring forward. We do need to try and declassify as much as is reasonable without disclosing sources and methods that would make us vulnerable. We do need to get this information out there. So he's become a very important character in this, both historically and absolutely in the present, because of his current access and his current position on the subject matter.
Yeah, because my understanding was also that and I don't know what year this is, but this is within the last few years, that he again was asked to set up another kind of task force or whatever. But at that time, he basically insisted and said, yeah, but if I'm going to do that, I need to have access to all the other departments, from the FBI to whatever they're called, all these acronyms, et cetera, et cetera. And he kind of built that network of people. He didn't call it a task force. I think he called it partnerships with these various, but that is, of course, even to someone, an outsider like me, that sounds interesting, because I'm sure, because of the secrecy, a lot of this has been going on without the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing, and so on and so forth. So, and now I think he's moved on to a private company, my understanding is, which allows him to not to open up, as you rightly say. Now, the final thing I just wanted to mention, that I think, well, I do want to get to the Wilson Davis memos just so I know what it is. But before, one thing, and that is what also seems to be happening right now. You talked about the legislative momentum. It seems to me now that, and I don't know the details, but you probably do, that there are now laws coming into place where you have like a whistleblower program where people are protected if they come forward. And it's almost like, well, if you worked on any of these secret programs, you now have to come forward. There's no choice anymore. And that's obviously a major shift from, you can't talk about this ever, and and now you have to talk about this. Is that correctly understood?
Yeah, this was a big advancement forward. If you compare the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act versus the 23, one of the biggest improvements on that was the protection for whistleblowers. And this is a game changer. This is, again, what we talk about and what we look at is momentum. So, it's not good enough to just, have a trend. UFOs have been trending forever. There's nothing new about that. But you need a catalyst, right? What's the catalyst that something different is going to happen, or there's going to be a shift? And the ability for people from secret access programs, retired or present, to come forward and report information is stunning. And what is being told, the guys that have helped to bring these people forward, in the past, again, Lou Elizondo, George Knapp, they're out there on podcasts presently, and they're saying, we have people. They're coming forward right now. They're already in conversation. They're having conversations with AARO, which is the all-domain anomalous reporting office, as well as directly with members of our Congress. And this is where it gets interesting too. I had mentioned this on some other shows, is that we also think there's a bit of a game theory aspect to this politically, right? So if you're a politician, and you've got an aspiring, career path to pursue, and you're being privy to these things that are not yet made available to the American public, and several congressmen and women have been. So even without being part of the Gang of Eight, they're seeing stuff, sitting on these committees, they're seeing videos. There's a high definition video of a UFO that's 23 minutes long, hasn't been released yet. But congressmen are coming out, seeing that video and saying, it seems like something out of Star Wars. So you now have this also political kind of who's going to move first, who's going to say something first. And you can see it. If you see the narrative, if you look at, Congressman Marco Rubio is a great example. They're talking about this, and you can see the pace picking up with that. Because, how often are you going to get something that's so mind-bending as a subject to bring forward and take a political stance on that looks like you're helping open that up? So we think the toothpaste is out of the canister, and it's not going to be easy to get back into it, and that's exciting.
Okay. Final question on these kind of people and events, and that's this Wilson Davis memo. Just because I heard you mention it, but I actually don't have no clue what it is. Can you share with that? Yeah.
Yeah. So a little background on this: the Wilson Davis memo was a document that was allegedly written by Dr. Eric Davis, and he was a scientist that was working for a private aerospace contractor called Earth Tech International. And the memo is said to be a summary of a conversation that took place between him and Admiral Thomas Wilson, who was the former director of of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and this was in 2002. So what's fascinating about this is that according to the memo, Admiral Wilson had attempted to gain access to a highly classified UFO-related program, and he was denied by officials in the Special Access Program. So this is interesting. I want to kind of repeat this for the audience. This is somebody that at the time is the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and they are being denied access to a special access program related to UFOs. And so Dr. Eric Davis had kind of recorded this, and this is what the memo is about. And what was interesting about some of the details of what the conversation is that the secret access program supposedly was involved in the recovery, and this is a quote, of off-world vehicles not made on this earth. That is a quote in the memo. Okay. And so, there's controversy as to whether or not the memo is authentic or not. People that are experts on this have, said absolutely that it is. But what's interesting is that memo is now part of the congressional record. So when we had a hearing about UFOs last year, the first in more than 50 years in the United States, this was introduced. It didn't get covered. They didn't really get into the subject, but it was introduced and submitted. And so it's now part of the congressional record. And we expect that is going to be a significant conversation in Congress and in the public, this year. And that's going to get very, very interesting.
Very good. Very good. Now, we've talked a lot about what, quote unquote, we know, meaning the West, really meaning the US, right? And what's also interesting to me is that apparently there's momentum. There's going to be more hearings, I'm sure. But of course, we're just one small part of this globe. And so there's probably other countries, nations, superpowers that have had some similar experiences, you would think. They just don't seem to talk about it in hearings that we can participate in. So I'm curious here. I'm thinking about the Russians, maybe the Chinese. But what do we know, if anything, about their experiences? From what, again, I've heard, and I've obviously listened to some of the sources you've been talking about here. From what I've heard is, so I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, so I think there's been a report out recently in the US that talks about 144 sightings or encounters or something like that. But then in Russia, I heard, this came from George Knapp, that they've had, or from his work over many months with Russian sources, they had something like 45 encounters, of which 3 of them turned into, maybe the other ones did as well, I don't know, but there were 3 of them where these spaceships fired back, and they all, they took out the Russians' fighter jets, essentially, very easily. So, but anyways, I'm just paraphrasing what I've listened to. What do you know about other countries' experience in this field?
I mean, it's amazing. There's a lot, and there's a lot that's open. So after the Cold War, Russia opened up, and what was interesting, there's a great book called UFOs and Nukes by Robert Hastings, which is probably the best documented book on incidents involving UFOs over, nuclear sites. And this is something guaranteed in our opinion. Look, part of what we do is we take data, and part of what we do, it's professional speculation, right? So you got to kind of marry those things together and form a view. But what you had mentioned earlier is we have a very strong view that there is absolutely a direct correlation between what's happening with current sightings and nuclear conflict versus the last time that we had such an explosion in sightings and nuclear conflict. This to us is not not by accident. And so what George Knapp had found out, he did a lot of reporting on this after the wall fell. And he found out that what was fascinating is that the Russians were having similar incidents with UFOs coming over their nuclear bases as we were. And they thought that it was maybe advanced technology from the Americans, and we thought that maybe it was advanced technology from the Russians. And then afterwards, we're like, oh, wait a minute. Well, it wasn't you. It wasn't me. Well, what the hell was that, right? And then if you go to, incidents in Japan, there's been lots of incidents in Japan. I mean, there's basically been incidents worldwide, but there's places that are very open about it. Brazil, fantastic. Brazil's always been very, very, very open and treated, ufology as a sincere, real, discipline. There's a fantastic case out of Brazil that was in 1996, the Virginia case, which is amazing. There's a fantastic documentary called Moment of Contact that was released last year, and it's kind of the Roswell case of Brazil. And a UFO crashed, beings were seen, beings were captured, and the U.S. Air Force came down and recovered the craft and took the beings. There's eyewitness testimonies. It's a fascinating case out of Brazil, and Brazil's had tons of cases. So this is this is absolutely something that, there's information out there. The Chinese as well. Previously, the Chinese were, before Xi, there were, several, kind of conferences on this subject, and it was a bit more open with the universities there. They announced last year that, they were picking up radio signals from other planets suggestive of, extraterrestrial life. You've got NASA back on this stuff. So again, this is kind of that momentum. There's been historical, things previously, but I think you're going to see a race this year for lots of countries. By the way, on this point, I don't remember. I think it's going to be later in this year. The United Nations is going to open this up. So the United Nations is going to have an actual, conversation on this, and you might see this, turn into, a very sincere, global conversation amongst countries.
Now, let's bring it up to date in a sense that before we talk more about the why now, perhaps, what's up with the balloons? Because the balloons don't really seem to be how should I put it, sophisticated. So how do they play into all of this, in your opinion?
I think that most importantly, it has created a situation that, global media and U.S. media in particular really need to lean into the White House and get some questions answered. And there's a fantastic investigative journalist out of Australia, Ross Coulthart, who wrote the book In Plain Sight, and he's been leaning into this as well. So, we shot down 4 things. Only one do we know what it is. What are the other 3? How are we supposed to believe that we've shot 4 things down, first time in U.S. airspace ever? NORAD command is involved, and we can't recover. We don't know what the other 3 things were. That's just completely implausible. We could send a helicopter. We could send our own drones down. We can send people by foot. We can send, any number of resources. We're the strongest military on the planet, and we've shot things down over U.S. airspace, and we're not able to tell the public what they were. So, and again, I'm not suggesting that those things that we shot down were alien spacecraft. They very well may not have been. They might have been advanced drones. We don't know. But it's concerning that all of a sudden, a topic that has been going on for the last couple of years because of these programs, like we know that our defense agencies are supposed to be taking this stuff serious. We know that behind the scenes, they do take it serious. And yet the excuse to the public is that they just kind of tweak their radar systems, and so now they're picking up balloons and other stuff. Nonsense. I don't believe that for a second. And I think that the public needs to continue to lean into the White House and demand answers.
Yeah, no, it does seem very very odd. Now so obviously a lot of what we've talked about today, David, is kind of factual. We've talked about real people. We've talked about real incidents that are well documented. We haven't really speculated a lot. We've just tried to provide some context and some facts. Now we speculate a little bit more when we ask the question, why is this happening now? And both you and I have already alluded to the fact that maybe it has something to do with what's going on in terms of the hotting up of the conflict and so on and so forth. But could there be, I'm just curious, I mean, I have no idea. I mean, could there be other reasons why now, in your opinion, having studied this a bit much more?
Yeah, so our favorite is the nuclear connection. We believe that that's very logical. But there's others. One of the ideas, from our chief technology officer, who's very big on this theme as well. He said that, look, we're at an inflection point technologically, obviously not just for nuclear capabilities, but also look at what's taking place with this turning point in artificial intelligence. And he said, we know people have made the statement. Elon Musk was saying that he thought that, artificial intelligence was much, much more serious and much more of a risk to humanity than nuclear weapons. And so maybe it's this, technological inflection point with artificial intelligence. One of the other theories that personally I like, and I believe that there's some truth to it, is that one of my favorite cases, and there's a documentary on this as well, is the 1994 Ruwa, Zimbabwe case. So in the middle of the day over a school called Ariel, a UFO, and there's more than 60 eyewitnesses to this. 60 eyewitnesses to this. A UFO literally landed right in the middle of the day in front of a school. These children saw it. They went over, some beings came out of the UFO. Kids were later able to draw this and report it. A famous, Harvard psychologist named John Mack went over and interviewed the children he was fascinated by this case. And the documentary goes and re-interviews these children now as adults. Now, what was interesting to me about what was communicated and conveyed to the children as they reported was they reported hearing messages, basically communicating telepathically with these beings. And this is not uncommon. We hear this a lot. This is, typical of, encounters that are described. But what's interesting is that these children individually reporting the same message, that we're not taking care of our planet, that, we're destroying the planet, and that it's in danger. And this was in 1994. Certainly that hasn't changed. Climate change is a big theme. Our firm is very active in environmental trading. So we trade all types of environmental assets, renewable energy certificates, carbon credits, now biodiversity credits. So that's another one of our macro themes. So I'm a little biased because that's a macro theme that we already have. And it's kind of interesting to see that potentially those things are two themes that may be merging together. So some people would speculate that this is a type of intervention, that, hey, we're about to just completely destroy our ecosystem, our biosphere, and that requires some type of intervention. That's a possibility. We don't know.
No, interesting. Another thing, so last year we had a guest on, Dr. Pippa Malmgren, and we didn't spend any time actually on this particular topic, although she did say, listen, there are so many things going on in space. She wasn't referring to this specific, she was referring to the conflict in space between Russia, China, and the US, and so on and so forth. But she has written about these things as well. And she's also been asking some questions as to, why might we be hearing about this now? I think some of the stuff she said was, I think she even questioned whether it had something to do with the fact that we are now getting ready to build bases on the moon, meaning we're now moving into another part of the universe, so to speak. And it's kind of funny. I'm Danish by background. It's kind of funny because she wrote something where she said, and she talks about this starship that can lift 100 ton or whatever that has been built. And she says the starship looks set to carry the Danish designed 3-story space habitat. I didn't even know Danes were capable of designing habitats for the moon. But anyways, I'm pretty happy to see that. But I mean, there are, of course, so many reasons why this could be, if it is. I mean, again, and it's, I guess it warrants a little bit more time and consideration. I want to finish off with just a few questions. David, you've been very generous with your time. One is, if you are going to point to the single best piece of evidence that we have, is there anything that kind of springs to mind, or can you even identify what you would say, yeah, I think that's the best evidence we have?
I think that there's lots, but I think probably the best modern one that we have is the incidents around the USS Nimitz. I think that that's just like, if you really get into the details of it and all the data plus eyewitness testimony, it's just phenomenal. I mean, and it opens up a lot of questions, what's going on. And, Dr. Pippa is amazing. I think that she's absolutely right that there's, some correlation with what's going on in space. And she's an expert on that, for sure. I love one of the, the terms that she came up with. We've kind of, teased in about the term galactic macro, but she uses a much more interesting term, which is exopolitics. So off-planet, political, issues, which is brilliant. So I suspect this is my personal belief. I think what we're going to find is that we have made breakthroughs in reverse engineering of, extraterrestrial craft. That's actually what I sincerely believe. I think that we have the craft. I think that we've had it for a very long time. I think that we finally figured out how some of it works. I think that there's probably extraordinarily dangerous implications of understanding how that technology works. It's not just, the government blocking, free energy or anti-gravity machines that would change humanity. There's probably very serious implications to, weaponizing those technologies. But I think that this information is going to continue to spill out, and it's going to create a very, very interesting, world for us here very quickly. So I think we're going to have breakthroughs in space travel that are going to go way beyond anything that SpaceX is doing. SpaceX is going to look like, a horse-drawn carriage versus the tech that we actually are probably already, capable of deploying.
Very, very interesting. And certainly I wouldn't rule anything out nowadays. And actually, I wanted to get to that point as well, just a little bit, which is, of course, the professional side of your work and some of the themes you're finding, your galactic macro themes. Now, so just to sort of energy, I guess, could be an area that could be potentially impacted. You talk about defense. Maybe even travel. I mean, how long is the list of things where you could see something that none of us can, fathom today, but where if it's true and if we have, as you say, and maybe this is why it's coming out now, maybe it's down to the point where the powers above, so to speak, the whatever political elite we have, know that this is about to break, this is about to come out, and we either scare the public completely, or we give them a little bit of a kind of a dose by dose kind of a approach to this. So yeah, what are the other kind of things that you could see being impacted?
Lots. So I'll just throw out just various samples of this, and again, so I'll kind of flex our discretionary macro for a moment in the way that we think about these things. So the one that most people have heard me talk about, which is kind of the fun one, is being long Lockheed Martin because they're sitting on this technology, right? And that's a real position.
So essentially, what you're saying is you believe they have one of these spacecrafts in their possession, and they have studied that and are coming out with maybe some new technology soon, or based on that. Yeah.
We believe that they have the technology, that they understand the technology, and that they've built with the technology. So that's a pretty significant statement, and that's a whole deeper conversation as to why we have such strong conviction with that. But in addition to that, so let's say let's play this out for a second. So let's say that the U.S. is in possession, does understand it, and has built with it, right? So what does that do for the U.S. dollar? Well, it certainly is going to strengthen the U.S. dollar. What does that do for being able to protect Taiwan? So maybe you want to be long Taiwan equities because, now it looks like the U.S. could easily defend Taiwan in a conflict with China, right? So if we're the only ones that have it, and hopefully that's the case, that it's not, widespread because, that would have some scary implications. There's all types of things. The energy theme is a very big theme for us. Should we be, shorting uranium companies on every uptick that they get? I think that you will see some, I think we're going to have breakthroughs in energy very, very, very quickly. Whether that comes from alien spacecraft or not is to be determined. But I think that we are going to have a very serious conversation about, interesting technology. And I'll add to this just something for folks to think about from a technological perspective and how these things affect technology investments. There's a gentleman, if you look at the Roswell case, there's a gentleman named Lieutenant Corso. He wrote a book about technology that was found. So he was in the Army, and he was tasked with studying the reverse engineering and passing some of that technology to private industry. And there's 4 technologies that he claims came from the Roswell incident, from reverse engineering. The integrated circuit, so basically the microchip, lasers, microwave technology, and fiber optics. Now, think about how much, technology has advanced for humanity just on those 4 technologies. And, people don't associate those with coming from UFOs. And, I'm not saying with 100% certainty they did, but they might have. And if they did, you have to kind of, reflect on that trajectory and all the things that kind of changed across markets and, across society because of those breakthroughs.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, and I don't want to speculate too much, although it's difficult not to on an episode like this. But also, I mean, you mentioned this thing about what if the U.S. could protect Taiwan, blah blah blah. Yeah, but I mean, what if, again, some of the countries that we are not so friendly with actually have similar technology from their experiences? Because I've heard people talk about, I have no idea if this is true or not, things like Russia, they now have like a torpedo that can go 10,000 miles straight into the, from Russia to the US. I mean, things like that where you think, okay, that's not normal unless you have something incredible. And so all I'm just saying is I think that there is both very positive outcomes that could be, but as you said, there could also be opportunities where you want to be short, even though I have no idea how this is all going to play out. But I hope we might be able to continue this theme and this conversation, David. So just a couple of questions I wanted to end up with. One, I normally would ask this as a manager, and I know you manage money, but I'm not asking you as a manager. I'm actually more asking you as a observer of all of this. And that is, what keeps you up at night? When you think about all the stuff that you've come across, I mean, is there anything that kind of keeps you up at night and where you're a little bit worried about this stuff?
Oh, that's a great question. What keeps me up at night is that, believe it or not, I'm actually optimistic for what can come about from these things, and I'm 100% aligned with you in that. Yes, some very scary stuff. So maybe multiple countries have this technology, probably, right? And maybe that's why we're seeing more actual, encounters with UFOs. Maybe it's other countries, but for sure, there's a high probability that there's stuff coming onto the planet, from elsewhere, and maybe that's part of the intervention. But what keeps me up at night is probably the excitement that we're going to stimulate curiosity in our present generation that's much needed. We have, our current generation is just completely distracted with, TikTok, social media. There's an article the other day describing how, Gen Z doesn't even know how to use technology in the workplace. Just because they know how to use social media, they're actually like failing to use basic technology in the workplace. And I think that it's fascinating that if all of a sudden we're looking up at the stars rather than looking down at our mobile phones, that's an incredible, improvement of, our current state of affairs. So what keeps me up is the excitement more than the worry, thankfully. And so I'm very encouraged that, a lot of amazing things are going to come from this.
Okay, no, I like that answer. Now, this is another question that I tend to ask managers after an hour's worth of conversation. But today I really have to ask you this because I felt so unprepared for this topic, but still with a lot of excitement and really wanted to learn more, curiosity, I guess. So I normally would ask people, what should have I asked you? What did I not ask you? Is there any particular point that we missed in our conversation that you want to bring up before we wrap up?
No, you were very thorough, and I appreciate the open-mindedness to have this kind of conversation. One of the things that you mentioned is that, your observation that this doesn't appear to be a conversation anywhere across the investment space. And I agree. And I think the open question, not just from you, but from me, is why not? because if even 1% of what I'm suggesting is taking place, and obviously I believe it's a lot more than that, and people should look into it themselves. But even just 1% of what I'm saying is actually taking place, this is a life-changing conversation. It is a market-changing, even if, you don't care about the aliens, whatever, but you're just a market professional and you got to manage a portfolio every day. The implications for this are just, almost impossible to fathom. And they're certainly worthy of starting to think through, because it will make waves. So I appreciate your observation on that. And I think that that's a question we can both leave open to, the community. Hopefully this dialogue will stimulate more people asking that very question.
And in addition to making waves, David, I hope it makes trends, because as you know, I'm a trend follower. So regardless of whether we know anything about this stuff or not, if there will be trends in markets because of this, I can assure you CTAs and other trend followers will hopefully be able to catch them, just to make this conversation a little bit relevant for my normal topic. David, this has been a mind-blowing conversation. Thank you so much for doing this today. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our listeners will. And I hope that we manage to make people think about what is going on in the wider world right now, but also why we're suddenly being given all this information at this point in time. And before we go, let me just encourage you to go and follow David's work. I will, of course, put a link in today's show notes, because as you can tell from today's conversation, we're living in a truly unpredictable and ever-changing world, and it is perhaps more important than ever before to stay well-informed. From me, thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to being back with you as we continue our Global Macro series. In the meantime, take care of yourself and take care of each other.
Thanks for listening to Top Traders Unplugged. If you feel you learned something of value from today's episode, the best way to stay updated is to go on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so that you'll be sure to get all the new episodes as they're released. We have some amazing guests lined up for you, and to ensure our show continues to grow, please leave us an honest rating and review in iTunes. It only takes a minute, and it's the best way to show us you love the podcast. We'll see you next time on Top Traders Unplugged.